The house had never been that quiet before. Claire Beaumont stood in the doorway of their bedroom at 6:30 in the morning, still wearing her coat, her keys hanging loose in her hand. The bed was made, not slept in. The pillow on Daniel's side still had that faint indent from 2 nights ago, and for some reason that was the detail that stayed with her. Not the silence, not the empty driveway, but that small hollow in the fabric where his head used to be. She set her keys on the dresser, took off her coat, sat down on the edge of the bed. Her phone had 4 missed calls from him. She hadn't listened to the voicemails yet. She already knew what had happened. She had known for 11 days. But knowing and standing inside the knowing were 2 very different things. And this quiet house, this cold morning light coming through the curtains she had picked out herself 3 winters ago, this was standing inside it. She had met Daniel Voss at a conference in Ottawa. He was the kind of man who knew how to listen, really listen. The kind where he'd tilt his head slightly and make you feel like whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. She was 31. He was 34. She was a structural engineer with a small consulting firm, and she'd just landed her first major contract. He sold commercial real estate and made it sound almost poetic. They were married 18 months later in a small ceremony outside Kelowna. Her mother cried. His father gave a toast that ran 4 minutes too long. Claire laughed at all the right parts. For the first 2 years, things were good. Not perfect, no marriage is, but genuinely good. They bought a house in a quiet neighborhood in Burlington, Ontario, close enough to the GO train that Daniel could get into Toronto easily. She worked from home 3 days a week. They had a dog, a rescue named after no one in particular, just called Biscuit, who slept at the foot of their bed, and once chewed through an entire loaf of sourdough they'd left on the counter. It was a life, a real one. Then Daniel got a promotion. The promotion meant more travel. That was the first thing. Then it meant later nights. Then it meant a new circle of colleagues. Dinners Claire wasn't invited to. Events she heard about only after the fact. Photographs on LinkedIn where he was laughing with people she had never met. She told herself it was the nature of the industry. Real estate ran on relationships, on proximity, on being present. She told herself this while eating dinner alone on a Tuesday. She told herself this while falling asleep at midnight with the TV still on because the house was too quiet otherwise. She didn't start to suspect anything until March. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on a collar, no late-night text that lit up his screen. It was smaller than that, a shift in the way he spoke to her, a new kind of distance. He started leaving the room to take calls, not in a theatrical way, not like he was hiding something obvious, but casually, naturally, the way you might drift toward the window for better reception. Except he'd never done that before. She noticed. She didn't say anything. Not yet. The confirmation came on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of March. She'd come home early from a site visit. The weather had turned, sleet coming down in sheets across the QEW, and she found his laptop open on the kitchen island. She hadn't meant to look. She'd reached past it to plug in her phone, and the screen had woken up on its own. The messages were there, all of them. Her name was Priya. She worked in his office. The messages went back 4 months. Claire stood at the kitchen island for a long time. The sleet ticked against the windows. Biscuit came and sat beside her feet, and she reached down and held the back of his warm neck without really feeling it. She closed the laptop. She poured herself a glass of water, and then she made a decision that would determine everything that came after. She was not going to react, not yet. She called her sister Lynn that night, from the parking lot of a Tim Hortons down the road. She didn't go inside, just sat in the car with the heat running and talked for an hour. Lynn was the practical one, always had been. She didn't say, "Are you sure?" or "Maybe there's an explanation." She said, "Okay. What do you need right now and what do you need for later?" That question cracked Claire open in a way the messages themselves hadn't. What she needed right now was to not fall apart. What she needed for later was a plan. Lynn knew a lawyer, not a friend of a friend, not someone she'd seen advertised on a bus shelter. A real one, a woman named Patricia Osei who specialized in family law and had a reputation for being exceptionally thorough. Claire booked an appointment for the following Monday and told Daniel she had a client meeting. In the 11 days between finding the messages and standing in that quiet doorway, Claire had done the following things. She had photographed every document in the filing cabinet in Daniel's home office. She had made a list of every joint account, every asset, every investment she was aware of. She had spoken to Patricia twice. She had moved 3 months of her own salary into a personal account she'd quietly opened at a different bank. She had said nothing to Daniel. She had cooked dinner, watched television beside him on the couch, asked about his day, and smiled at the appropriate moments. She had been, to all appearances, exactly the wife he thought she was. He had no idea. When Daniel finally came home that morning, it was just past 7 now. She could hear his car in the driveway. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Biscuit lifted his head from his bed by the window but didn't get up. Daniel came through the side door and stopped when he saw her. He was still in yesterday's clothes. His tie was loosened, jacket over one arm. He looked tired and caught, and underneath both of those things, guilty in the particular way that men are guilty, when they've been somewhere they shouldn't and they know that you know and they're still calculating whether to admit it. "Claire," he said. "Hi," she said. He set his jacket over the back of the chair across from her. "I can explain. You don't need to." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I already know where you were." The color shifted in his face. "How long have you?" 11 days. He sat down. That surprised him, that she wasn't standing, wasn't raising her voice, wasn't throwing anything. He'd been bracing for something operatic, and instead she was sitting there with her tea like it was any other morning. "I love you," he said, which was a strange thing to say, and they both knew it. "I know you think you do," she said. "Or you did. I'm not sure it matters now. Claire, please." "I've already spoken to a lawyer," she said it evenly. "Her name is Patricia Osi. You'll want to get one, too." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard in that kitchen. He didn't take it well. That was perhaps predictable, but the specific shape of how he didn't take it well was something Claire hadn't fully anticipated. Within 2 weeks of that morning, Daniel had moved out, staying first with a colleague, then, as she later found out, with Priya in her condo in Liberty Village. He'd taken the car he'd paid for, his clothes, his golf clubs, his grandmother's clock from the mantel. He'd left the dog, which told her everything she needed to know about what he valued. But then something shifted in his approach. He stopped being contrite. He started being strategic. He told her, through his lawyer, a man named Gerald Ashworth, who wore expensive watches and sent tersely worded letters, that he believed the house should be sold and the proceeds split, despite the fact that Claire had contributed 60% of the down payment. He suggested that her income, which had grown substantially in the past 2 years, meant she should not expect any support. He also, and this was the part that made Patricia set her pen down and look directly at Claire across the boardroom table, claimed that certain joint investments had decreased in value, figures that did not match the statements Claire had photographed in their filing cabinet 11 days before she'd said a word to anyone. "He's trying to hide assets," Patricia said. "I know," Claire said. "I photographed everything." Patricia smiled for the first time in the meeting. Good. It was her colleague Nadia who kept her standing during those months. Nadia Ferreira, who had the office next to Claire's at the consulting firm, who brought her lunch on days when Claire forgot to eat, who never once said "I told you so," even though she'd had quiet reservation about Daniel from the beginning. "You're not falling apart," Nadia said to her one evening, the two of them sitting on Claire's back porch with wine, early May, the lilac bush along the fence just starting to bloom. "I keep waiting for it, and you're not." "I fell apart in October," Claire said, "for about 3 weeks. When I first started noticing things, I cried in the car a lot." She looked at her glass. "By the time I found actual proof, I'd already done most of my grieving. That's the saddest and most impressive thing I've ever heard." Claire laughed. The laugh surprised her. It felt real. The hearing was in late June. It had taken weeks of back and forth. Gerald Ashworth's letters, Patricia's responses, financial disclosures, counter-disclosures, a forensic accountant who had been brought in to examine the investment accounts whose stated value had mysteriously shrunk between November and March. The forensic accountant's name was Owen Tran. He was methodical, soft-spoken, and utterly devastating to Daniel's case. He had found, in the documentation Claire had preserved, clear evidence that funds had been moved. Not lost, not depreciated, but deliberately repositioned in ways designed to reduce the apparent marital estate. Daniel sat at the opposite table in a gray suit and did not look at her. Claire sat beside Patricia and did. She watched him throughout. The way he shifted in his seat, the way he leaned toward Gerald to murmur something during Owen's testimony, the way his jaw tightened when the judge asked him to clarify the timeline of the transfers. She had spent almost 4 years reading this man's expressions. She knew what each of them meant. He was scared. Good, she thought, and then felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The judge was a precise woman named the Honorable Marguerite Lalonde, and she was not impressed. She went through the financial evidence methodically and without theater. But the conclusions she drew were unambiguous. The house would not be sold. Claire would retain it, buying out Daniel's portion at assessed value, which Patricia had already arranged financing for. The investment discrepancy would be resolved in Claire's favor, with penalties. Given the circumstances of the marriage breakdown and the deliberate misrepresentation of assets, the settlement leaned heavily toward Claire. Gerald Ashworth requested a brief recess. The judge denied it. Afterward, in the corridor outside the courtroom, Patricia put a hand briefly on Claire's shoulder and said, "You did everything right." Claire nodded. She thought about the night she'd sat in the Tim Hortons parking lot in the sleet, calling her sister. She thought about the 11 days of stillness and planning. She thought about Owen Tran's quiet, thorough voice, dismantling a year's worth of financial maneuvering in 40 minutes. She thought about the morning she'd sat at the kitchen table with her tea, while Daniel walked through the door in yesterday's clothes. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown anything. She hadn't given him the drama he would have known how to navigate. She had simply been prepared. The drive home took 40 minutes. She stopped at a grocery store in Aldershot. Not because she needed anything particular, but because she wanted to do something ordinary. She bought bread and coffee, and a bunch of flowers that were slightly overpriced and very yellow. Back at the house, she put the flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter. Biscuit came and sniffed her shoes and then sat beside her while she made a sandwich and looked out the window at the backyard, where the grass needed cutting and the lilac on the fence had finished blooming but was still green and full. Her phone buzzed. "Lynn, how did it go?" She typed back, "We won." Then, after a second, I won." Lynn sent back a string of hearts and then called immediately, and Claire answered laughing, "Already." It was Nadia who asked her, months later, what she'd do differently if she could go back. Claire thought about it for a long time before answering. "Nothing," she said finally. "I wouldn't change the ending, but I'd have trusted myself sooner. All those months of making excuses, telling myself I was imagining things." She shook her head. "I knew. I just wasn't ready to know that I knew." Nadia nodded. "Most people never get ready." "I know." Claire looked out the window of the coffee shop they were sitting in, at the street where autumn was already starting to strip the trees. "I think that's the part that took the most out of me. Not him. Not the settlement, not the lawyers, not any of it. Just the months of convincing myself not to trust my own eyes." She picked up her coffee. "I won't make that mistake again."